to serve as the moderator for this webinar. It's going to feature primarily the presentation by Arvin Gouw, but it's a little bit more complicated than just that. We're going to have a response from Professor Ted Peters, professor at the Center for Theology and the Natural Sciences at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, California. Ted will be given the microphone for a brief period of time following the main presentation, and then we'll go back to our presenter, Dr. Gouw, for a quick comment on what Ted has shared. And then, and we hope this is not too late for many of you, then we will turn to the questions that are posed by the wider audience of participants in this webinar. Now, to get your question into the queue, take your cursor and take it down to the very bottom of the screen. Click on the Q&A icon that opens there. A little box will open, type your question, hit enter, and I will be able to see your questions and monitor them and select from the most lucid, the most succinctly worded, the most sharply focused, and present those to our speaker tonight for discussion. Now, if that is not enough for you, let me also invite you to open the chat feature. You won't find that that's enabled in terms of being able to put in chats of your own, but you will see there that there's one message, and in that message is a URL, internet link. If you are adept with the mouse, you should be able to copy that link, paste it into your web browser, hit enter, and join a meeting that will begin in roughly 2 hours. Right now it's 5 p.m. where I am, Eastern Time. At 7 p.m. Eastern Time, a meeting on Zoom will open for discussion and direct audience participation with each other. So if that's of interest to you and you have the time, please join us for that conversation. But once again, the format here for this webinar is a presentation by Professor Gouw of Stanford University School of Medicine, followed by a brief set of questions delivered by Professor Ted Peters, then back to Arvin Gouw for a comment on that, and then I will be selecting questions that have been submitted in the Q&A feature on your screen. So Professor Gouw is, as I've said, a professor at Stanford School of Medicine in the field of oncology. He's also the Vice President for Research and Development in the Rare Genomics Institute. He will be speaking to us today in this seminar about his interest not just in science, not just in the leading fields of research in oncology and rare diseases, but in his interest in relating all of that to theology. So Professor Gouw, I believe we are ready for you, and I'm going to turn it over to you at this point. Thank you for making tonight's presentation. Arvin?
Thank you for the very generous introduction, Ron, and thank you, IRAS, for inviting me again to return. Unfortunately, we cannot be at the island like last year, but we will do with what we can. So tonight, I'll be talking about the COVID-19 and various theodicy models. And I have a presentation here. All right, so theodicy models in facing COVID-19. I like this comic because I think it summarizes a lot of what is going on currently during this pandemic time. I thought of this topic because I read Tom Wright's article, as many of you may have, he wrote this article in Time magazine that Christianity offers no answers about the coronavirus, and it is not supposed to. I was rather surprised. I kind of understood what he meant, but I was surprised because if we look at his book, Evil and the Justice of God, he does have several answers for the problem of evil. So in short, I agree, but not because there are no answers, but because there are too many answers. Some of these answers I've written in an article at Patheos and also at Sinai in Synapses for the intersection with science. How do we explore these possible answers then? And that's going to be the task of today's talk. And here's the outline. Part 1, I will be talking about the general versus special problem of evil, and then going into biblical responses to suffering. In part 2, I will talk about the COVID-19 scientifically and the problem of evolutionary evil. And then part 3, trying to reconstruct everything that we've talked about and talking about the current advances in COVID-19 research. As a disclaimer, the opinion expressed in this presentation are my own and not of the organizations that I'm affiliated with. All right, the general problem of evil. The problem of suffering is a problem for all belief systems, right? Why we suffer and why there's evil in this world is something that most belief systems have to address. And that's why this is called the general problem of evil. And let's look at, for example, to China for the non-biblical explanations to the cause of evil and suffering. One of the oldest philosophical ideas in Chinese philosophy is from Taoism, that suffering is in the mind. Here in Tao Te Ching, it says, even in paradise, the fool will turn the emotions clouding his mind into the reality of suffering. So it's in our minds. The Taoist sage has a mind empty as the blue sky. So he avoids the avoidable and faces the inescapable with equanimity. Does it mean that suffering is not real? This is, I think, the critique in Chinese philosophical history as well. So Confucius came into the scene and he says, well, suffering is real. Where does it come from? It comes from wrongdoings. It comes because people do not obey the proper duties, their proper roles in the country, in society, and in their family. That's the Confucian framework of society and governance. Well, okay, what about suffering that are not consequences of wrongdoings? And basically in the Middle Ages in Chinese philosophy, you have Zhuzi who kind of summarizes or tries to integrate both the Taoistic strands in Chinese philosophy with the Confucian strands, with other strands within Chinese philosophy and some of Buddhism as well, perhaps. And here he argues that yes, suffering comes from disobedience, but disobedience kind of comes from emotion. So here you have both aspects. Now, will this hybrid explanation suffice to address the problem of evil? So Chinese philosophy here, if we look at the summary, well, a very, very crude in 4 slides, that evil is an illusion of the mind, but suffering can also come from duty. You combine those in the Middle Ages, not unlike Thomas Aquinas integrating everything in the Middle Ages in the Western Europe. The Chinese philosophy here seems to largely explain only moral evil, but not natural evil. And perhaps the absence of the divine limits their responses. Now, from the general atheistic philosophy, can we go into early religions? Where do we go to? Let's go to the ancient Near East, early civilizations. If we go there, we find one proposal, for example, that evil comes from an evil god, Zoroastrianism, that there is a good god called Ahura Mazda, there's a bad god called Ahriman. And the two have been in battle since the creation of the universe. This is one of the first explanations to the source of evil. And Zoroastrianism influenced Roman beliefs like Mithraism in the first centuries, in the early centuries, and influenced even further to St. Augustine, Manichaeism. So this is a very, very dominant idea. In general, though, even back then, there is this feeling that, well, why is evil so powerful that there has to be a constant battle all throughout the ages? Kind of the same thing that St. Augustine was asking. Has polytheism solved the problem of evil, including natural evil? And what if one of the solutions is, well, what if we make one of the gods slightly higher? Why don't we make the good gods slightly higher, then the evil comes from the lesser gods, right? This is henotheism. We find this actually in early Israel, and even in the Bible, it kind of creeps in. In Psalm 82, James Crenshaw here argues that Psalm 82 endorses this view of a pantheon of gods, right? That suffering comes from the inability of the gods, the lesser gods, to assert justice on earth. The indictment of these derelict deities by a single heavenly being, Elohim, the Israel's God, marks the first truly revolutionary moment in biblical thought, the death of the gods and ensuing monotheism. Now, did henotheism improve or make things worse? I think it might have made things worse in terms of addressing the problem of evil. That's why when it comes to monotheism, we have a special problem of evil. Why? Now you're down to one God, one agent. This God is omnipotent, also benevolent, yet evil exists. Right? Now, if we go back in the general problems of evil, for example, Confucianism does not believe in God explicitly, so automatically premises 1 and 2 disappears. The problem is solved. In Taoism, even if they have some kind of divine ideas, they deny premise number 3, that evil exists. It's a illusion in the mind. Sometimes it's called religion of dissolution. In polytheism and henotheism, you basically deny premise number 1, that God is omnipotent. Why? Because you have multiple gods, either all equal in power or one higher than the others, right? Only in the monotheistic religions, where you obliterate the other gods and you only have one God, that we accept all 3 premises in Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. And this is where the special problem with evil arises. Now, I'm funneling here from general philosophy to polytheism, henotheism, monotheism, and now to Christianity. Now let's look at the biblical responses to the special problem of evil within Christianity. One of the first solutions, one of the first answers is that evil is a punishment for breaking the covenant. This can be found in the Torah, in the book of Genesis. In Genesis 15, we saw this Abrahamic covenant as a legal contract. And in that legal contract, in the Hittite contract form, there is a section of blessings and curses, meaning what happens if you fulfill the contract, what happens if you break the contract. And this became the source of the idea that suffering comes as a result of punishment for breaking the contract. Right? This also helped explain this idea of corporate retribution, where a whole group can be punished due to the error of a member of the group in the contract. Right? Or the theory of federation, for example. But is it fair to punish the whole for the fault of the few? We have a different answer. Evil comes from disobeying wisdom. We see this in wisdom literatures. In Proverbs, we see, do not be afraid of sudden panic or of the storm that strikes the wicked. For the Lord will be your confidence and will keep your foot from being caught. Meaning, if you're not wicked, if you follow the rules, if you follow the laws, you're wise, then you will not be struck by the storm, right? And I think the book of Job is an example of anti-wisdom. It questions this. Well, why do good people still suffer? Does the Bible have another proposition? Yes, good people still suffer because it is part of God's plan. It's above that. And we see these ideas, for example, in the prophetic literature. Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Isaiah all began to de-emphasize the retribution idea, whether it's retribution from breaking covenant or from breaking the law, a source of evil. Here, Jeremiah 29:11 is one of my favorite, though it's an interesting application of this verse to defend the divine plan. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future. Now the question then arises, if it was God's plan to give us hope and future, why does it have to include suffering? Well, the suffering is a necessary part of a test, and we find this in Peter's letters. Beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery ordeal among you which comes upon you for your testing, as though some strange thing were happening to you. So here we can see the cross of Christ becomes the cruciform pattern for all Christians. This cruciformity can be understood as the need for Christians to undergo trials and tests, just as Jesus did. Well, if God is the test maker, and this test includes suffering and evil, does it not mean that he is also the author of evil? The Gospels and the Revelation, by this time, the devil has evolved from God's right-hand man, from the early Old Testament writings, to more of God's opponent, adversary in the New Testament. And here, my favorite is Luke 22. Then Satan entered Judas, called Iscariot, one of the 12. And Judas went to the chief priests and the officers of the temple guard and discussed with them how he might betray Jesus. So now it's the devil's fault. Well, does it mean that all suffering come from the devil? Is it always the devil's fault? Paul says, well, not quite. Suffering comes also from original sin. In the Romans, he says, therefore, just as sin entered the world through one man and death through sin, and in this way death came to all people because all sinned. This sin takes place in multiple levels for Paul: personal level, socioeconomic, political, and cosmic. The socioeconomic and political implications of sin comes from more post-liberal readings of Paul, more new perspectives on Paul, right? And the cosmic implications of sin comes from more apocalyptic reading of Paul, but also from Romans 8. You have a cosmic implication of the original sin. So then we have here original sin because we broke the covenant. Did we just come full circle to breaking the covenant? Have we come into a circular argument here with the problem of evil? I think this is the problem that we have. We have too many, perhaps, biblical answers. Evil comes from breaking the covenant. Evil comes from disobeying wisdom. Part of God's plan, part of a test from the devil, from original sin. Are there only 6 answers? Do we have to memorize everything? Well, there's this very important work edited by Antilado and Johannes de Moor, covering basically collecting experts, biblical scholars, going through each book in the Bible and seeing what theodicy answers or what answers to suffering each book provides. Even the apocryphal books, it's about 900 pages. It's encyclopedic in its nature. Do we have to memorize all that? How is there an organizing principle behind them? And this is one of my first task when I saw this. Is there an organizing principle behind them? And my proposed paradigm is, let's simplify things. Maybe there are 2 general clusters here. There are responses that tend to be etiological, meaning trying to find the source, which is usually in the past. That source of suffering is the devil, or the abuse of our freedom, the necessity of our free will, or original sin, or fall. But there are also responses that tend to be teleological, which means looking at the purpose of suffering. This includes divine plan, the test view, moral contrast view, which basically means we have to know the bad in order to know the good. We have to go through suffering in order to cultivate our virtues. Right? So this is kind of looking at the purpose of suffering. And these are the 2 paradigms that I see across all the various models. What is the rationale behind this proposed paradigm? And the rationale is pretty Aristotelian, in my opinion. When we ask about why something happens, we look at causation, and we look at primary, efficient, formal causes. But we also look at final causes in terms of what it is, what it is for. So what do churches do? And I think churches integrate the 2 models, right? So for example, here the Catechism of the Catholic Church, in addressing natural evil, integrates even Satan's agency in natural evil, right? Although Satan may act in the world out of hatred for God, and although his action may cause grave injuries of a spiritual nature, and indirectly even of a physical nature, to each man and to society, right? It's integrated here. They are all permitted by divine providence. So here you have a teleological language here. So you have a nice combination of etiological and teleological models here embedded. Given my Reformed background, of course, I have to summon the Westminster Confession. Here you also see similar language, sins of angels and men, the theological notions, but also language of providence and of control, of ordering and governance by God. So again, you have a mix of these two. Now, it seems that the classical models, the 6 biblical answers, can be extended to respond to natural evil. I'm trying to get to natural evil because I'm trying to target COVID here, right? Basically, the devil could cause disasters. Our free will could cause some anthropogenic evil. This is a notion maybe developed by Celia, for example, Dean Drummond, that our actions causes global warming. So natural disasters maybe are not so natural after all. Original sin can cause cosmic corruption. Okay. In terms of teleological models, perhaps nature could be incorporated, natural suffering, evolutionary suffering could be incorporated into the divine plan, test view, and moral contrast view. Okay. Now, can these models address COVID-19? Now we'll go to the part 2 of my talk, where we will explore the science of COVID-19 a little bit. So what's COVID-19? What's SARS-CoV-2? There's a nice paper here from JAMA just a few days ago, basically talking about the pathophysiology, transmission, and diagnosis of COVID-19, coronavirus disease 2019. So basically SARS-CoV-2 is a virus inside it, or viral RNA. When the SARS-CoV-2 binds to 2 receptors on our lung cells, TMPRSS2 and ACE2, the virus then can enter by endocytosis. When the virus particle enters, it releases its RNA materials to our cell, hijacks our cells to keep producing even more viruses so that more viruses can be produced. When more viruses are produced, what happens is that our immune system responds, right? So a lot of T cells are being recruited, T lymphocytes, monocytes, neutrophils, and they release cytokines to recruit even more immune cells to come in. And this is the early stages of COVID-19. And the later stages of COVID-19, when you have a lot of our white blood cells coming in, you're basically making the wall of the lungs somewhat permeable, right? You're increasing permeability, and this is why you can have a fluid intake, pulmonary edema in the lungs. And moreover, this constant battle of the immune system against the infection causes the formation of scar tissues, which stiffens the lungs. So this combination of the stiffening and the liquid, the edema, manifests as troubled breathing, symptomatically, right? That's why it's very interesting for me to hear if people say, well, SARS-CoV-2, is that really the cause? It's our immune system. If we're perfectly fine immune-wise, then we'll be okay. Well, I'm not sure. I think that's a complicated discussion with immunologists, right? Because it is precisely because our immune system is reacting that you have such heavy recruitment of our immune cells. And in terms of categorizing COVID, it's interesting. What is a virus? A virus is not alive, but it's not really dead either. The fact that it's not alive sometimes makes people think, well, was it lab created? No, SARS-CoV-2 comes from bats and pangolins. So for example, if you look at here, the viral RNA of the SARS-CoV-2, you can look here for the part of their nucleotide that codes for the spikes. And it codes for the amino acids here for S1 and S2 of the spikes. And you can see that in both, you can compare that the human sequence is very, very close to the bats and the pangolins. Okay, so this is an early Nature Medicine paper that I think is very important. Is it still evolving now? Yes, it is. It is still evolving in humans. This is a nice tracker where you can see, this is color-coded by country, but you can see every person that's been sequenced, genetically sequenced. You can see, for example, here, this patient in the US, July 7th, 2020, the virus has already evolved. It already has nucleotide mutations and amino acid mutations, okay? So what are the implications of this viral evolution? Not great. So the G614, for example, has increased infectivity. So the earlier form of the virus, the D614 of SARS-CoV-2, was earlier on found in abundance, but in February in Europe, the G614 mutation arises, and since then it has taken over and becomes the dominant form. Why? Because G614, SARS-CoV-2, produces a lot more virons, viral particles. So it reproduces a lot faster. And moreover, if I remember correctly, this isoform also is less detectable in blood. So if you were to get tested by PCR, the levels are slower because they tend to aggregate in the lungs and to cause more severe phenotype there. So then they're less detectable. The people who are detectable are probably D614, you're hospitalized, you're kind of quarantined for everybody, it doesn't spread as much. While the G614, they're more aggressive, less detectable. So then they're selected for, right? So this is the evolution take place. So I guess the question with COVID-19 theodicy is, why does it allow the evolution of this half alive, half not alive virus, however you want to categorize viruses? How do our theodicy models address COVID-19? If we look back at the etiological models, for example, is the virus from the devil? Well, I mean, it's from animals and it's a virus, so we know that. Is it due to our abuse of free will or freedom? It has been suggested overpopulations and the use of wildlife food resources, markets that cause cross-contaminations across species and evolutions of viruses across species create the SARS-CoV-2. Is this original sin? Due to original sin? I'm not sure. I think that's an untestable hypothesis beyond the realm of science. Now, in terms of the teleological model, it's interesting. If this is a divine plan, if COVID-19 is the divine plan, my question is divine plan for who? For those who survive? For those who died? It's similar with the test view. Is this for people who survive? What about for those who died? Is it for the families who lost their loved ones? These are difficult questions to answer. And with the moral contrast view, do we really need COVID-19 to know what is good and to do what is good? And fundamental to all of this, I think, is COVID-19 a moral or a natural evil? I think this is still an interesting puzzle and a unique case for theodicy, where we usually categorize things by moral or natural evil. COVID-19, I believe, is neither a moral nor natural evil. It's an evolutionary evil, if you want to call it. It's an evolutionary problem. Are there any responses specific to evolutionary evil? Fortunately, yes, thanks to IRAS and thanks to Zygon. This is the issue 2 years ago, celebrating Christopher Southgate's birthday and the introduction of Arthur Peterson as the new editor. This whole issue is dedicated to evolutionary theodicy. Now, what are some of those evolutionary theodicy models? I feel like I'm explaining to my own teachers here, so I hope I'm quite accurate in my presentation. Let's start with Christopher Southgate because it was his, the issue is dedicated to him. So here for Christopher Southgate, there's glory of God in creation. Glory here is not necessarily about beauty or radiance, but it's better understood as a sign of the unknowable depths of God. Glory may be discerned in the natural world, which includes situations of pain and suffering. For Christians to be transformed from one degree of glory to another might mean becoming a sign of the great sign of God, that is Christ, and conforming our longing to God's longing for the kingdom to come. Now, I think the critique to this idea is random evolutionary suffering required to bring about God's glory? Or is this the only way for God to bring glory in creation? Holm-Charleston says no. He doesn't think that nature is a mixed bag, random mixed bag of good and bad through chaotic genetic evolutionary process and natural selection, as proposed by Southgate. All suffering leads to flourishing of all kinds of life in the end, according to Ralston. And this is because creation is cruciform in its structure. So it's developing a cruciform nature. one can question then, well, if God created the cruciform nature and within that cruciformity there is evolutionary suffering, that God is still the author of that evolutionary suffering. Here, Celia makes an interesting move. Celia Dean Drummond makes the move, well, let's attribute it not to God, but to Lady Wisdom. And let's construct the stage beyond just man, but to all of creation. So influenced by Hans Urs von Balthasar, Celia expands the notion of theodrama to include other species as actors in the drama of creation and all of nature as the stage. Influenced by Sergei Bulgakov, this is where Celia makes an interesting move. She introduces another character to the theodrama, which is Lady Sophia, which has been known to, in the Orthodox theology, to the Sophia manifests both the presence and hides the presence of God in creation. There's a mystery to it. And Sophia, being the ordered wisdom within creation, gives room to evolutionary suffering in nature. The critique to this would be, well, why would in his wisdom God includes evolutionary suffering? Here, being a Barthian or following Barth, influenced by Barth, and Neil Messer argues that there is no form of evil or suffering that is part of divine plan, intentional or permissive, right? This is Barth's notion. Evil is completely out of it. Evil is a nothingness, das Nichtige, following Augustine. So the source of evolutionary suffering is just this potentiality or nothingness, inherent in nature, yet not something that was ordained by God. I guess the problem with such a privation idea is, well, how does the threat of non-being be so real? William Dembski resorts back to a conservative idea that, well, the Bible says, Genesis 1:3, that suffering comes from as a consequence of the fall of Adam. Well, how do you explain the suffering of animal prior to the death of animals prior to Adam? He says that has a retroactive effect, that the fall of Adam has a retroactive effect, or that God preemptively sets up nature to include all this pain and suffering, knowing that Adam would fall. So Dembski thinks that he's in a middle position between Ken Ham, young earth creationist, where there's no suffering prior to Adam's fall, but also in between him, Ken Adam, and also Hugh Ross from RTV, Reasons to Believe, that animal suffering is not due to the fall. Right? But how well does this model explain natural evil? Here, Boyd, earlier on, argues against Ralston, Nancy Murphy, and George Alice. He doesn't like God's natural cruciform design because God is still the designer. Boyd is also not content with the free will defense of Eldon Plantinga and soul-making theodicy of John Hick, because natural evil is at a much larger scale than humanity. You know, Marilyn McCoy Adams also says this. How can human free will and the consequences of human free will can as an explanation for the evolutionary pain of all of creation, which is at a much larger scale in big history. So for Gregory Boyd, the solution is, well, the only being capable of wreaking such havoc in nature would be Satan, right? Now, was then Satan created to demonstrate God's glory? Have we come full circle again to Christopher Southgate's idea? All right, how do we reformulate these ideas and what are the future directions, so to speak? I think the proposed theodicy framework still works, that these evolutionary theodicy concepts that I just went through still fall under these two categories, I think, in terms of the big picture. Some of them are looking for the sources of suffering, the etiological models. Boyd finds the source of suffering from the devil. Celia finds it in Sophia. Dembski finds it in fall of man, and Messer finds it in Das Nichtige. And some other evolutionary theodicy models find it kind of like the purpose of suffering. Christopher Southgate finds that purpose in glory, in God's glory. I think the ones that I have not discussed here is Niels Gregerson, Dennis Edwards, and Elizabeth Johnson use the deep reconciliation as the purpose, that Christ is coming as a deep incarnation that will reconcile all of creation, the big history, and the purpose is deep reconciliation. And then the cruciform participation. that we have to go through suffering to come to be resurrected again, to come to new creation. And I think these are the ideas of Holmes Ralston, Ted, Nancy, and George Ellis. Which model do you like best? What are the weaknesses of each model? When are the models not applicable? Do some of the models contradict each other? Are the models constructed by only the victor, meaning by only the ones that survive? Consider Job's children who died throughout that whole process. What was the purpose in all that? What can we reconstruct? What are the strengths of each model? Which models go together? Can one model be the dominant model, the divine plan as the dominant model? Do all models build up to a meta model? It's the same way of asking the question. Now, perhaps a different approach is, do different circumstances demand different models? Because biblically, different circumstances gave different responses in scriptures. Do different personalities favor different models? And does the strength actually lie in the flexibility of the network of these various models rather than in any one or in any meta structure? I think these are interesting discussion questions that can be discussed later. Now let's go back again to the framing of the special problem of evil to try to reconstruct things. The special problem of evil in monotheism, I think is interesting. The way it is framed, I think it gives us an insight. God is omnipotent, God is benevolent, evil exists. Why is this special problem unique to monotheism? Is this a problem of balancing divine attributes in the presence of evil? I think so, because if you get rid of the presence of evil, for example, questioning evil's existence, like in St. Augustine and then followed by Aquinas and Barth, evil is a privation of good, a privatio boni. The suffering happens due to maybe God's absence, right? And the remedy is reconciliation. The problem with this is probably, well, how much more real does evil need to be considered to exist? Now, the teleological models, if you take evil seriously, I think the teleological models try to emphasize God's omnipotence. It's all still parts of God's plan and a test to bring glory, to develop virtues within us. God has everything under control and everything will be all right. Whether in this life or in the next, God is in control. But how benevolent is God here? On the other hand, I think etiological models emphasize God's benevolence. God never wanted people to suffer. The source of suffering is never God. The source could be our sin, other people's sin, the devil, or even Lady Sophia, but not God, right? However, God loves us, so he suffers with us in solidarity, using Sully's language, suffering on the cross. But how omnipotent is God here? So it seems like there is a balancing of divine attributes, that perhaps the etiological model de-emphasizes divine omnipotence, while the teleological model de-emphasizes divine benevolence. So do we keep trying to balance the two sides ad infinitum? We've seen the biblical writers and theologians and contemporary people in the theology and science try to navigate through this. What would Jesus do? Right, this is the pastors in the pulpit pushing the theologian to answer. You're right, Jesus doesn't juggle models. He never had to have a discourse on theodicy with his disciples. He simply helps those in suffering. And I think for me now, the conversation will switch because I'm a scientist. What are we scientists doing in response to COVID-19? And if scientists are doing this, Christians and non-Christians, religious and non-religious, I think it compels all of us to respond. All right, so what are scientists doing? I think there is a rise of coronavirus tech. These are all the various companies now that are blossoming, trying to approach COVID diagnostics, detection, patient monitoring from various angles. Any promising ideas? Yes, from the very moment that we knew of the SARS-CoV-2 mechanism, there have been proposed targets, drugs to target the attachment entry of the SARS-CoV-2, the targeting the uncoding of the virus particle and unloading its viral RNA. There are targets here, for example, remdesivir, to target the replication of the viral RNA. So these are a priori approaches. We know what the virus does. What do we do? Now, what about agnostic approaches, right? Inductive. What if we just look at the virus and see what it's doing? So this is a very good paper. This was, I think, 2 weeks ago or so, a phosphoproteomic map, which basically tries to study if you look at the SARS-CoV-2 protein from the virus, which are the red diamonds here, what do they, with what human proteins do they interact with? So here you can see this diamond protein interacts with that human protein, the gray circle, right? And what does it do? Upon interacting, what happens is that this human protein from 0 to 24 hours after encounter, after infection, that phosphorylation increases. Or it goes blue, phosphorylation decreases. So by looking at phosphorylation patterns of these human targets, we can tell which genetic programs are being turned on and off by the virus. Right? Do we have targets that are promising? Yes, so they narrowed down to key viral particles that are on the surface that are actually interacting. They identified the human proteins, and after they identified the human proteins, they look at what these human proteins actually affect downstream. After they identify all this, then they were able to try to map this to existing drugs associated with them. And this is the list. There are many potential repurposed drugs that can be repurposed to target these various aspects. And this is a great start. And these are drugs that can be repurposed, existing drugs. You might ask, well, can we, instead of using drugs that are not supposed to be for COVID, but hoping that it'll work in COVID, are there efforts in creating completely novel drugs? Yes, it requires a lot of money. Fortunately, or unfortunately, depending on your perspective, the biopharma venture capital funding has been increasing. It's actually been the highest in the past decade. This is an article yesterday from Forbes. I was very surprised because, we keep thinking of recession, the stock market's going to crash. But here we see actually, in terms of biopharma, the funding is increasing. So this allows a lot of innovation. Am I doing anything in particular for COVID-19? What am I doing now? So I'm a cancer researcher, so I'm trying to reorient and develop my cancer nanotechnology system. Instead of detecting floating cancer cells in the blood using nanotechnology, use it to detect COVID-19 instead, and to screen existing and potential novel drugs. And finally, if a drug is discovered, when they're put into patients, we can hopefully monitor the therapeutic response in the patients using the system. And perhaps giving this talk is also a way to encourage us all to do something. And I'm not alone in these efforts, and I'm indebted to so many people. And I'm acknowledging these various organizations for their support throughout this time. And this is the summary of my talk today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Arvin Gouw. A terrific talk, and no doubt is going to spark many, many responses and questions. If you have a question for Dr. Gouw, use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Just take your cursor into the bottom bar, open up the Q&A link, and when the window opens up, type in your question, and I will be able to read through them here and select from them questions that we're going to address to Dr. Gouw. First, however, we're going to go to Ted Peters, and he's going to be speaking live here as part of the webinar. He's got some comments and no doubt some questions for Arvin. And Arvin, as soon as Ted has wrapped up his questions, you're going to pick it back up and talk with us a few minutes as you seek to respond to those questions. So, Ted, we're ready for your comment.
Well, Arvin, thank you for that extraordinary presentation. I'm not sure I'm being heard. Could somebody confirm that the audio is functioning?
Yes, I can hear you, Ted.
Oh, all right, good. Well, I appreciated the combination of scope and precision in your approach, Arvin, to lay out the logical theodicy problem and then provide illustrations of the various options drawing from the history of Chinese philosophy, as well as the peculiar problem that Western monotheism, and it's actually not Western, it came from the Middle East, and laying all those out. So I really appreciated the scope. I appreciated the succinctness with which you distinguished each model, of which there are many models. I found fascinating a couple of the models, the Dembski fall into sin model that retroactively had sin influencing natural evil, or the model of the angels having fallen and they're responsible for natural evil. There was one other model that I didn't hear you mention, and that is that we can blame the fall into sin and the retroactive history of suffering and evolution on the Republican Party. I do think that that's a model that seems to be very forceful in today's everyday experience. I have noticed that in the Western philosophical tradition from Plato on, that we have assumed, and I think rightly assumed, that evil is irrational. The evil is fundamentally mysterious because it cannot be understood by its very nature. Truth is rational and evil is irrational, and philosophers like to use the example of lying, for example. Nobody can consistently and incessantly lie and get away with it because it's self-contradictory. Whereas truth, on the other hand, can prevail consistently and over time. And I wonder if this is in fact the case, if the philosophical tradition is correct, that evil is irrational, if by constructing the theodicy problem in terms of the coherence of three propositions, if it isn't asking for the impossible in its solution. And that would be generally the case. It wouldn't be a specifically Christian or monotheistic problem, although you gave good reason why monotheists have this problem and polytheists and henotheists do not. And it's pondering this that's led me to think of theodicy historically rather than logically. Evil, sin and evil, are just givens in the scripture, and they're just givens in the story of Jesus. And what we get in the story of Jesus is that on the cross, God becomes a victim of evil, not the perpetrator of evil, but the victim of evil. And the resurrection of Jesus on Easter is the divine solution, almost a repair, a fixing. I have come in my own view, and you're familiar with this, to think that it's the resurrection of Jesus on Easter which really discloses God's plan for creation, new creation, logically precedes the creation that we're currently in. So, in short, I offer a futuristic historical solution to the problem of evil rather than a rational or a logical one. Now, Arvin, I would like to ask two questions. The first one is scientific and the second one is theological. Could you please reiterate what you already said about the immune system in light of the SARS-CoV-2 virus? I thought you said, please elaborate, I thought you said that the invasion of the virus capitalizes and cannibalizes an already healthy immune system and turns our immune system into its own service for its multiplication, almost a Dawkins type of selfish gene scenario. And if that is in fact what you said, then could you speculate how would a vaccine work? If it improves the immune system, won't the virus simply say, oh, goody, I can do even better now with an improved immune system? So please just help me clarify. I know there's a reasonable answer to that, but just help me understand that better. So that's my scientific question. My theological question is, are you satisfied with not having a logical or rational solution to the theodicy problem coming from Christian theology? Could you buy into the historical solution, which I think I share with Jürgen Moltmann and Wolfhart Pannenberg on this, that it's God's action. So it'd be a historical rather than a logical solution. And one more comment. And this is not a question, it's a comment. I think by your emphasizing that the scientific community, as well as the rest of us in fighting COVID-19, are trying to do the good. So that means, anthropologically speaking, we have an inclination to embrace the good rather than the evil, and we end up getting tested. Korea and Taiwan, Taipei, they pass the test. The United States and Sweden don't pass the test. So natural evil has given us an opportunity to test our sinfulness, and some of us are looking better than others. So that's just my comment. So I will sign off and leave you with my two questions. Bye.
Thank you, Ted, for the summary of my talk and for the insights that you provided. So with regards to your two questions, the scientific one, it is true that SARS-CoV-2 hijacks our cells to be able to reproduce, to be able to produce more viruses. All viruses do this, that's true. But I think, does it mean that we should not develop vaccines? No, because basically we develop vaccines, the virus does not even have enough time does not even have the opportunity to infect, so to speak, to enter the host cell. So I think that's kind of the mission of vaccines, is to prevent that even very early stages to happen. But the design is, of course, very complicated in terms of what part of the virus do we target first, is the S particle, and so forth and so on. There are very good papers speculating, arguing for what should be done first. With regards to the second question, am I satisfied with not having a solution? Yes. I think being a Christian, if we can solve all puzzles, then we don't worship a living God. We're just worshiping a philosophical system that is neat and tidy. Now, do I buy into your historical perspective? Yes, I do. I think I would this is the part that I'm still considering and I'm still developing. I think a historical perspective rather than a philosophical one takes in the view of apocalyptic theodicy very importantly, in the sense that we do not know what our problems are, what evil actually is, and what they mean until we see the coming of Jesus. Proleptically, to use your language, right? Only that after we see the solution, we know what the problem is, and this is barred. So, in the sense that nature is still incomplete, using Terry Deacon's language, nature is incomplete. So, I'm slightly leaning towards this Pannenberg's idea, thanks to your influence, your influence, that the future has some kind of ontological priority, and we're drawn to that. And we as created co-creators, using Phil Hefner's language, then we are bound to do good and to bring about good and to bring about that new creation as best as we can. So I think, yes, I think the apocalyptic tradition has a reversal of historical aspect to it that I think would be necessary. So I'm leaning slightly towards the etiological models, because doing, sorry, the teleological model. I'm getting my own models confused. I'm focusing more at the purpose, because finding the source is not always very easy when it comes to natural evil. And there are always problems with causations. And I think this is, with complex systems, there are always problems about discovering the cause of certain things. This is thinking of Bob Lanovich's proposal, Alicia Huerrero's, thinking of causation might need to be reformed into constraints or something like that, right? So thinking along those lines, I think focusing more on the future is very important, and taking a historical perspective of the problem of evil is also important. Thank you, Ted. And I'll give the floor back to Ron.
Well, thank you so much, Arvin. Thank you, Ted. And now we have an opportunity for 30 minutes or so to engage questions that have come in from our audience. I have 4 questions that are on the same theme. The most succinct version is from Stanley, who asks, how does process theology handle theodicy? Let me elaborate on that. Let's expand from just the Whiteheadian, Hartshorne version of process theodicy to include any form of theism, right? We'll stay within theism. Any form of theism which does not accept, without qualification, that very first point on your slide, that God is omnipotent. What if God is not omnipotent? For the process theologians, of course, and philosophers, God is inherently not omnipotent. For some that sort of stand in the middle, Jürgen Moltmann perhaps would be an example of this. God pulls back, as it were, from being omnipotent in order to create that which is other than God. Let's say an evolutionary cosmos with evolution of life on a planet. One way or the other, is it possible within theism to challenge the notion of God's omnipotence and not solve the problem of theodicy, but undermine its one of the foundations on which it stands?
Yes, thank you, Ron, and thank you, Stan. I think, Ron, you're right on the mark that process theology de-emphasizes divine omnipotence, because God is co-evolving with creation. There's a process. And to a certain degree, maybe the process of God is also not that benevolent, because he is in the process, is part of a natural process. If you're going to be pure Whiteheadian, it's very Hegelian in nature. It's very panentheistic or pantheistic. So I'm not the God is not necessarily personal God. So automatically the divine attributes no longer become an issue. Yes, so that's what I think. In terms of Moltmann, Moltmann does give this room for freedom. I think Moltmann does allow freedom to, this idea of Zimzum, giving room for us out of creatio ex nihilo, out of the system, so that we can have some freedom. I think that is an interesting idea. There are many proponents. Interestingly, I think evolutionary theologians, for example, like Celia, rejects that, because then evil becomes completely out of control, and she would rather have evil still within the controls of the theodrama. So I think there are multiple different responses to Moltmann's idea as well.
Yes, thank you. While you're referring to Dean Drummond, let me ask you to clarify a term that you used, and that is cruciform. I think at one point you said nature is cruciform, representing one view, or you used the term cruciform participation. Participation can be a technically demanding term, but let's stay with the word cruciform. What does the word cruciform mean in this context?
I think when Ralston uses cruciform, I think he means that suffering is a necessary part of coming out the other end, of coming out to some better goods, to some greater good. I think in that sense, nature is cruciform in its shape. When I use the word cruciform participation, I'm influenced by new perspective on Paul reading, especially Michael Gorman, the idea that if you want to participate in God, then you have to follow Christ, and Christ's life is cruciform in nature. So our participation is also cruciform in nature. So the two ideas are intertwined here.
Let me read this question. This is from Nancy. How does all this talk about theories of evil help people actually do anything about COVID?
I think that's a great question. I think it might help pastorally if we have people who ask. I think it might help if certain theodicy models within their tradition helps them give comfort. That's one. Second, I think it helps in an apologetics context. Suppose an atheist or people from other religions attack us. Well, how come your Christian God allow COVID-19 to happen? Then you will say, then you can spew out all the theodicy models and also mention, well, this is actually a general problem of evil. Every belief system has to handle this. So this is second. And the third, I think the message is, despite all the theodicy models, we don't have an answer. So this is fine for us to think about, to reflect upon, but it is not an excuse for us to not act upon it.
You seem to tilt, I think, in your presentation toward the teleological, the soul-making direction, possibly. One question asks, in other words, does the urgency of the pandemic spur us? I'm not sure if she means, this is by Lisa, I'm not sure if she means us individually or us as humanity. I kind of read it more as us as humanity. Does it spur us to be more helpful or to be better people? Do you affirm the soul-making account generally?
Oh, I think I can agree to it in general, because this allows us to be better people, and to be a virtuous person, we do need some challenges that we practice we need to cultivate our virtues on. So I think in that sense, yes, it is important. And I think Lisa's virtue ethics, I think your virtue ethics would be very helpful here, because a pandemic like COVID-19, every person will need to do their best in whatever they do. And this is going to be, an attack on multiple fronts, a joint effort from each person's expertise and trying to do their best. Yeah.
Let me pick up on a question from Saul. He says, U.S. citizens are now having an enormous debate of claiming free will, claiming liberty to use or not to use masks. All right. Well, let me expand this a little bit. U.S. citizens and citizens of the advantaged countries around the world are about to have a huge debate about how to share the benefits of research. Suppose we have an effective vaccine, and suppose we have 1 billion doses in the next year. Who gets the 1 billion doses? So let's go into one kind of slice of your talk here tonight and talk about human freedom as one of the ways in which there is evil in the world.
So I'm not getting the question. So what is exactly Saul asking?
Does the human response to COVID reveal the truth that human free choices magnify evil? And he's asking about the freedom to use masks or not to. I'm expanding that to say the freedom to hoard vaccines or other treatments, other drugs, or not to. In other words, is there some legitimacy to the old version of theodicy that human beings act freely, sinfully?
Yes, I think definitely. I think how we respond will definitely either improve things or make things worse. It's just the nature of freedom is it's a double-edged sword, and I think it's always very difficult for people to perceive when we try to exercise our freedom to make a choice. We always have to see some kind of a perceived good, and this perceived good is what people cannot always agree on, whether this perceived good is maintaining one's freedom, not being close in a mask, or whether this perceived freedom is about, protecting other people, protecting your family from the disease, right? There's so many different frameworks that people get into in their worldviews when they're considering this. And I think the notion of common good needs to kick in. So can we find a notion of common good so that people can think through their freedom and exercise their freedom in more of a coherent way, hopefully. Yeah.
So a question that would take us more back into the science, and so let's ask Arvin, the scientist here, just in terms of general understanding of evolution, do viruses play a positive role?
I think positive or negative is always a second degree intention that we put on natural processes.
Okay.
And this is always, it's the same thing with suffering. Suffering, all of the theodicy models tend to be anthropocentric because we're the ones suffering. We try to create evolutionary theodicy models, but it's actually kind of biocentric, life-centric. It's centered on living things that can sense pain. So it's very pain-centric. And I think it's inevitable. Natural processes would not be a suffering if there is no one around. So the viral evolution would not be positive or negative if there were nobody to feel the pain. It's a second level of interpretation that we put on it.
All right. Let me take us back to a theme that we were playing with earlier, and that is sort of this "what would Jesus do" motif. At least one person referred to that as the premise of a question. But how do we look to exemplars? For Christians, obviously, Jesus being the chief exemplar. How do we look for exemplars to suggest to us not so much maybe what to think about evil, but what to do about evil?
How do we look for exemplars? I think this is an interesting question. I think this is what people cannot agree on, because I think people's worldviews will define the authority figure, and that authority figure becomes the example, right? So I think this is always the problem. How does authority play into one's worldview? Who are the authority figures in this pandemic? Whether it is a pastor who would say that you should still congregate despite COVID-19, right? That's the authority figure, and your worldview is in that kind of mindset. So then you embrace that figure authority as the ultimate exemplar. Or you have other worldview, or Fauci is the expert, so therefore we need to listen to Fauci. Yeah.
Chuck writes this question. Diseases are part of the self-organizing forces that maintain the structure and function of ecosystems and the biosphere. Does that fit into your thinking?
Diseases as part of the ecosystem?
Part of the self-organizing forces that maintain the structure and function of ecosystems and the biosphere.
Yes, I can see that. I think even genetically, there is always pruning of excessive cells. For example, life and death are always in balance in constructive and destructive ways to maintain life, both at the cellular level, organismal level, and definitely at an ecological level as well.
Marjorie writes this, is perhaps COVID-19 causing humanity to rethink not only its focus on material acquisition, but also attitudes toward death? If there is life beyond this life, don't we live this life in a different manner?
Yes, I think definitely. I think all kinds of suffering, the greater the suffering, the more people reflect on it, because the more it disturbs us, the bigger the threat of non-being, the more we reflect on what is going on here, why are things happening. And this is very interesting. And in terms of bringing the afterlife in, is also an interesting move. You know, during the Enlightenment, theodicy was born out of Leibniz, in the sense that, well, evil exists, God is omnipotent and benevolent. This doesn't make sense. Your God cannot exist. It's almost that kind of reaction to theology. However, Kant, I think, puts it the other way around. The fact that we still make sense of what is good and what is bad, and there's an agreement on what is good and what is bad, categorical imperative, our actions still make sense, but evil still exists today. That means there has to be an afterlife. Well, evil has to be extinguished. Otherwise, our sense of morality does not make sense. In order for our sense of morality to make sense, the argument of moral argument of practical reason, there has to be an arbiter of good and evil, which is God, and there has to be an immortality of the soul, because there's so many good people that are punished here, and there are so many bad people that are still flourishing. So the afterlife is a necessity. So that's an interesting Kantian moral argument when it comes to theodicy.
Yep. Well, we are pretty well through our list of questions. One person observed that you and I are wearing a shirt that looks very much like each other, so we're in good shape there. Here's a question, though, that might tilt you, Arvin, kind of in the direction of your being influenced by Ted Peters. We're not going to call Ted back in to answer this, but let's take the Christian idea, Christian version of resurrection, front and center here. How does the resurrection historically solve problems of theodicy? Or I should ask, does it, in your view, Arvin, solve the problem of theodicy? The suggestion seems to be that after the resurrection, evil was abolished. And this goes to what you were just saying a moment ago. But can you really be saying something so hard to accept that evil is abolished? Or is it that if you believe in eternal life, evil is in this world and left behind and therefore not significant?
Yes. I think this is interesting. I think when I think of the cross and the resurrection, it is always the defeat of evil, but always within the tension of the already and the not yet. Right? That it is already, but also not yet fulfilled. This Pauline tension within the present time and the future time of new creation. So we're in this middle period, we're in this transition period where we know what the final answer will be because Jesus has come and revealed to us what that ultimate victory looks like. Now it is our turn to follow him, to keep fighting evil, to bring about that new creation, to make that reality actually happen. Because we have the answer key, so to speak, and now we just need to work. It should motivate us. Yeah.
One final question, I think, by definition, is theodicy a problem to be solved? Let me elaborate that a little bit. You might recall the passage in which Jürgen Moltmann says it's not a problem, it's an open wound. Typical Moltmann, more flowery language. But is it a problem? Is it a logical, philosophical, theological problem to be solved?
I think it is a problematic, right? Sometimes theologians use this word. It is a problematic because it involves the balancing of divine attributes. There may propose solutions, but none of them will actually solve it. Now, what I would say is some of these solutions logically make sense, right? It's just that we don't always agree to the premises, but they logically make sense. Now, I will make a move that Alvin Plantinga does, which is we can provide a theodicy answer, logical answer. It is now at the burden of the people who are asking to prove that our answer beyond a doubt is incorrect. Because God should remain innocent until proven guilty, right? So likewise, if we can develop so many answers of what God possibly have done through all these theodicy models, then for you to say that God does not exist or God is wrong, you have to really disprove all the theodicy models that I have presented, that they logically does not make sense or they cannot possibly be true. So now the responses are just there to provide possible reasons, and these possible reasons are maybe enough to exculpate God, even though we might not know the solution, but at least the answers should create a fence, so to speak. Yeah.
Let me press you on that just a little bit, Arvin, because this is absolutely fascinating to me. In your mind, or as you would encourage people to look at this, is the theodicy question primarily located under apologetics or primarily under a kind of faith-seeking understanding framework for the one who is already convinced, yes, there is a God? If it's under apologetics, somebody might say to you, look, Arvin, this theism stuff just doesn't stack up. You say you believe in an omnipotent God, etc. If you say it's an apologetics question, you could legitimately say, yes, I want to deal with my friend who's raising this kind of protest against theism based on evil. I want to have an answer for my friend. I want to say something that might help that person get over a hurdle. But then Arvin alone, or let's say the individual Christian, or perhaps the individual in other theistic traditions, in maybe different ways, but similar ways. Arvin alone might say, but deep down, I don't have an answer. I do the work that I do, as my response, my faithfulness, my lived answer, but I don't have a logical answer. So apologetics, okay, we'll talk about it rationally. In terms of the existential living out of faith, do we really have an answer?
Yeah, no, I think that's a fascinating question. I think it definitely plays a role in apologetics. However, I do not want to put theodicy under apologetics, because for my presentation, I'm gearing towards the notion that the problem of evil is within theology proper. And if it is within theology proper, then of course, Trinity will also be influenced here in terms of how the Trinity is being developed. So this is a systematic theology problem. I think the problem of evil kind of touches many of the doctrines that we touch in systematic theology. If we can develop a theology proper, a Trinitarian theology that handles the problem of evil, when it comes to apologetics, it'll be easier. Right? It's still going to be a mystery, that's fine. Just like the Trinity is still going to be a mystery, but when we explain it to other people, it will still make more sense in that way. And I think I would even push this further, that ethics is kind of anthropodicy, that we need to provide justification for our actions. So if we see how God justifies his actions, it might help me justify my actions in developing my ethics. So these are two flip sides: the justification of us from sins, justification of God, how God justifies his actions will justify my actions in my ethics. So I see this theodicy problem within the framework of all of systematic theology.
Right. Very wise answer. And I think you're quite right that there's an apologetics version of it, a conversation in that context, and then there's a deeper rumination that people will have using the wider resources of their faith tradition. Well, thank you so much to Arvin Gouw for this exciting and thought-provoking and informative talk on theology and COVID-19. Absolutely fascinating. So thank you very much, Arvin.